You ever meet someone who seems deeply connected to you one moment and then suddenly they vanish, they retreat, they pull back, they get cold just when things were getting real? It doesn't make sense on the surface, right? Most people interpret that as rejection. They say if they wanted me, they'd show it. If they loved me, they'd come closer. But let me challenge that with something most people never consider. When an avoidant loves you, they don't move forward. They back away. And that's not because they don't care. It's because they care more than they're emotionally equipped to handle. See, this is where people get it wrong. Love isn't always expressed through closeness. Not with avoidance. For them, emotional intimacy feels like drowning. It triggers alarms in their nervous system that scream danger, exposure, vulnerability. So the moment they start to feel something real, their survival instincts kick in, not because you're unsafe, but because their entire psychological framework is built on self-protection, not emotional openness. This isn't about logic, it's about trauma. It's about early emotional experiences that condition them to believe closeness leads to abandonment, criticism, or shame. Maybe they were taught silently or explicitly that their needs weren't welcome, that love is conditional, that being vulnerable leads to pain. So now as adults, they run, not because they don't feel, but because they feel too much, too fast, and don't know what to do with it. You can't measure an avoidance love by traditional behaviors. You've got to observe the tension they carry, the conflict between what they want and what they do. When you see someone pulling away right when things get close, that's not indifference, that's internal panic. That's their subconscious trying to maintain control over a heart they never learned how to manage. Avoidants don't fear being alone, they fear being dependent. They fear that if they love you too much, they'll lose themselves. So when they start to fall, really fall, they often sabotage the connection before it deepens. They create distance to avoid being exposed. You might feel hurt, confused, even angry, but under the surface, that push-away moment is their clumsy, terrified version of saying, this is real and I don't know how to handle it. Now here's the twist. Most people walk away at this point. They take the retreat as final, as rejection, and sometimes it is. But other times, it's a door, a test, an emotional checkpoint, not one you should chase, not one you should fix, but one you should understand. Because knowledge is power, and understanding their psychological pattern gives you a powerful choice. Stay grounded and unattached, or keep trying to emotionally drag someone who's afraid of the very thing they crave. Don't confuse proximity with passion. An avoidant may pull back just when they start to feel safe. And that's the paradox. Safety equals risk in their mind. Comfort makes them panic. So they run, but here's what's even more wild. They expect you to run too. They expect you to validate their belief that love is unreliable, that people leave, that connection ends. So when you don't chase, when you don't panic, when you allow them the space, but stay solid in yourself, they start to question their default. They start to feel the difference. They begin to experience a new pattern, a connection that doesn't demand, control, or threaten their autonomy. And for someone with an avoidant attachment style, that is love. That's the seed of transformation. But don't get me wrong, this doesn't mean tolerate inconsistency or disrespect. This doesn't mean lower your standards just because you understand their trauma. Awareness is not permission. Understanding the psychology behind the withdrawal should empower you, not trap you in emotional limbo. You want to know if an avoidant loves you? Watch what happens when they feel emotionally cornered. Do they ghost you? Do they sabotage things the moment you open your heart? That's not always rejection. Sometimes it's revelation. It's their raw, unedited emotional survival mode, hijacking their ability to stay close. They don't know how to hold love without fearing it will collapse. And here's the key. If you can hold yourself in that moment, if you don't lose yourself trying to fix or follow them, you create a space where love has a fighting chance. Not because you chased it, but because you didn't. Sometimes the loudest I love you from an avoidant sounds like silence, like space, like pulling back. But it's not about what they say, it's about what they can't say. And if you listen closely, you'll hear it. Love wrapped in fear, intimacy tangled in retreat, and a heart that wants to open, but never learned how. Remember this, the closer you get to their heart, the further they'll try to run. But that run is proof you've touched something real. Let me tell you something that might shock you. Just because an avoidant isn't reaching out doesn't mean they've stopped caring. In fact, the exact opposite is often true. Some of the most emotionally invested people in your life may be the quietest, the most withdrawn, and the most distant. Why? Because for avoidants, love isn't expressed through engagement. It's hidden in surveillance. They don't talk about their feelings. They watch you from a distance, in silence. They observe, they keep tabs, they become what I call emotional ghosts. Present but invisible. There, but not with you. This is where the misunderstanding cuts deep. Most people assume silence equals indifference. That if someone doesn't call, doesn't text, doesn't show up, they simply don't care. But with an avoidant, silence isn't always rejection. Sometimes it's surveillance. It's presence without proximity. They're not absent, they're studying you. Quietly, relentlessly, and often obsessively. Here's what most never realize. Avoidance doesn't kill curiosity, it amplifies it. Avoidants don't shut you out because you're insignificant. They shut you out because you're too significant, and that scares the hell out of them. So instead of leaning into the connection, they back away and watch from afar, hoping to maintain some sense of emotional control. They may mute you, unfollow you, disappear from the surface, but they're still watching your story. They're still checking your updates, still asking about you through mutual friends. You just don't know it because they've trained themselves to love invisibly. Now let's get to the core of this. Psychologically, what's going on here? Avoidants are often emotionally flooded by intimacy. They don't know how to navigate closeness without feeling threatened. So when real feelings arise, not lust, not fantasy, but real attachment, their defense mechanism kicks in. That defense, emotional distance. But cutting you off cold, that's not the plan. The plan is usually, let me step back and keep an eye on this from a safer vantage point. So what does that look like? They'll view your stories within minutes of posting, but never comment. They'll like your posts after days of silence, just to send a low-effort emotional signal. They'll send accidental texts or show up in places where they know you'll be, but say nothing. It's not manipulation, it's avoidance at war with curiosity. Love wrapped in fear. Here's the catch. Most people don't recognize this behavior as emotional investment. They see it as games, ego, or narcissism. And in some cases that's true, but with avoidance, especially those with anxious avoidant traits, this is the closest they can get without triggering their internal alarms. They want to be close, but their system only feels safe from a distance. Let's go deeper. On a philosophical level, what's happening here is an emotional paradox. The avoidant loves without touching. They feel, but don't express. They attach, but only through detachment. It's the ultimate contradiction. I want to be close to you, but I'm terrified of what that closeness will cost me. So they compromise, they stay in the shadows, they observe, and to them, that's safer than being seen. But here's what makes this so painful for you. You feel it. You feel their presence even in absence. You sense they're still connected to you somehow, and that's not in your imagination. That's the energetic string between two people that hasn't been cut, even when communication has. And the avoidant, they're holding the other end quietly, hoping you won't drop it, even if they refuse to pull it back in. Now, let me be very clear. Understanding this doesn't mean you wait around. It doesn't mean you put your life on hold for someone who's emotionally unavailable, but it does mean you stop personalizing their silence as evidence of your unworthiness. It's not about your lack, it's about their fear. It's about their emotional limitation. When you recognize that, you step into your power. Because now you're no longer a victim of their behavior, you're a master of perspective. If you want to know whether an avoidant loves you, stop listening to their words and start paying attention to their shadows. The accidental views, the indirect messages, the way they hover without holding you. And that's not nothing. That's their language, a broken dialect of intimacy learned through years of emotional survival. But here's the deal. Love without expression isn't sustainable. You can't build a relationship with someone's curiosity. You need more than silent presence. You need action. So if you feel watched but not loved, seen but not chosen, remember this. You deserve more than someone's secret affection. You deserve a love that shows up, not one that hides. And that's the line you draw. That's the standard you raise, not because they don't feel, but because you do. You know, it's one of the most misunderstood signs that an avoidant is in love with you. It's not a big declaration. It's not flowers or a long text message pouring their heart out. It's something far more subtle and far more revealing. They start mirroring you, not deliberately, not consciously, but instinctively. Almost like their nervous system starts syncing with yours without their permission. It shows up in the way they pick up your phrases, mimic your habits, or suddenly seem interested in things that matter to you. And it leaves people thinking, wait a second, is that coincidence or is there more going on here? There's more going on. When an avoidant loves someone but doesn't feel safe enough to admit it, their body starts doing what their mind resists. They mirror. They adapt. They reflect your essence back to you in tiny, almost invisible ways. They don't even realize they're doing it because they're not expressing love the way most people expect it to be expressed. They're translating it into behavior, into alignment, into unconscious imitation. That right there is a crack in the armor. See, this is where psychology gets fascinating. Humans naturally mirror those they feel emotionally connected to. It's a deep limbic level bonding mechanism. But for avoidants, this mirroring is particularly revealing because it bypasses their cognitive defenses. Avoidants are experts at guarding their thoughts, hiding their vulnerability, controlling their words, but they can't always control their behavioral echo. They resist closeness consciously, but mirror subconsciously. And that's the signal most people miss. You'll start noticing it in small moments. You say something often, and suddenly they're saying it too. You share a habit like how you hold your coffee, and then weeks later, they do the same thing without realizing it. You get into a specific type of music, and somehow they're playing that genre around you. These aren't manipulative moves. This isn't game playing. This is their body reaching for resonance, even when their mind is screaming to stay guarded. And this is important. It's not about flattery. It's not about them trying to win you over. If anything, they don't want to show their cards. They don't want you to know how deeply they feel. But love has a way of leaking out through the cracks, especially in people who are emotionally repressed. So what do? They imitate, not to impress you, but because at a core level, they're blending with you. That's what emotional connection does. It synchronizes. But here's the thing you need to understand. For an avoidant, this is intimacy, not long talks, not vulnerability circles, not tearful confessions. No, for them, adopting part of your world, borrowing your emotional patterns, moving in tune with your energy, that is their version of, I feel safe enough to move with you. Now you might be thinking, but if they feel so connected, why don't they just say it? The answer is layered. Avoidants associate vulnerability with loss of control, with judgment, with emotional chaos. So while they might be feeling a storm of emotion, they've trained themselves to contain it, not through words, but through indirect behaviors. It's not emotionally mature, but it's emotionally honest. Because while their mouth stays closed, their nervous system starts dancing with yours. Let me make this practical. If you're dealing with an avoidant who seems distant, cold, or guarded, but you notice they're slowly absorbing your world into theirs, don't dismiss it. That's not random, that's resonance. That's their version of peeking over the wall they built and deciding, maybe I trust this person more than I thought, but be careful. Don't confuse mirroring with progress. Just because they're reflecting you doesn't mean they're ready for deep partnership. Awareness is not the same as accountability. Imitation is not the same as commitment. What this does mean is that the seed is there, the seed of attachment, the seed of emotional recognition, and it's up to them whether they grow it into something real. Your job is not to chase that seed. Your job is to notice it without losing yourself, to honor that mirroring as a sign of connection, but not a reason to lower your standards or delay your healing. Just because someone is showing silent affection doesn't mean they're ready to love you out loud. You deserve someone who not only feels your impact, but also owns it. Someone who not only reflects your light, but stands beside it. So if an avoidant starts mirroring you, understand what's happening. Their walls are trembling. Their emotional system is reacting to your presence. That's powerful. That's real, but it's also incomplete. And here's the final truth. You can't build a future on reflection alone. So notice the mirroring, but wait for the action. Because love isn't just what they absorb from you, it's what they're willing to give back. There's a pattern that plays out in almost every connection with an avoidantly attached person, and most people never even recognize it for what it truly is. I'm talking about the constant push-pull dynamic that feels like emotional whiplash. One moment, everything feels aligned, you're connected, it feels safe. Then suddenly they go distant, cold, silent, and you're left confused, questioning everything, asking yourself, did I do something wrong? But what if I told you that sudden distance is not punishment? It's not indifference. It's a test. It's their warped, unconscious way of asking one critical question: will you stay if I make it hard to love me? Avoidants test your patience, not because they're malicious, but because their nervous system is wired for mistrust. Deep down, they don't believe in unconditional love. They've been programmed through trauma, rejection, abandonment, or neglect to believe that people leave when it gets hard or when they show their real selves. So when you come into their life and begin to offer warmth, consistency, or depth, they don't lean into it. They challenge it. They need to see if your love has limits, if your presence is performance or permanence. That's why they'll pull away when things feel too good, why they'll go silent after a moment of closeness, why they'll pick fights over trivial things or withhold affection at the worst possible moment. Because what they're really doing is measuring your reaction. They want to see, will you panic? Will you chase them? Will you validate their fear that people always abandon them in the end? Or will you stand grounded, unaffected by the storm they're trying to create? And let me be crystal clear. This isn't healthy. It's not mature love. But it's not manipulation either. This is survival. This is someone trying to confirm their internal narrative. If I create chaos, you'll leave. And if you leave, I was right not to trust. That belief is their anchor. It keeps them emotionally protected, but it also keeps them emotionally isolated. Now, here's where it gets deep. When you don't react the way they expect, when you don't explode, chase, beg, or crumble, you short-circuit their system. You give them a new reference point, a new data point their nervous system doesn't know how to categorize. And that's where something powerful happens. Because your calm in the face of their chaos becomes undeniable proof that maybe, just maybe, you're not like the others. But here's the trap. Many people fall into this test and think, if I just keep proving myself, they'll eventually let me in. That's where you lose yourself. Because the test doesn't end with one pass. Avoidants will retest again and again until they decide to face their own fear or until you break from exhaustion. And that's why your awareness must evolve. You cannot keep proving your loyalty to someone who hasn't proven their readiness. You can understand their trauma, but you can't sacrifice your peace to heal their past. You want to know if an avoidant loves you? Watch how they test you. Watch how they provoke withdrawal, silence, distance. And still look for signs you haven't given up. They'll do things to see if you'll reach out first. They'll create emotional tension just to measure if your presence is stable. And the more you pass their tests, the more confused they get. Because they didn't expect you to be consistent. They didn't expect you to stay when they made it difficult. And don't mistake this for emotional immaturity alone. This is philosophical. This is a person wrestling with the existential fear of being truly seen and not being enough. So they'd rather push you away than risk being fully loved and then rejected. They'd rather test you than receive you because testing gives them a sense of control. Receiving makes them vulnerable. But here's the pivot. Your response to these tests defines the future of the relationship, not just for them, but for you. If you respond by abandoning yourself, by proving your worth, by shrinking to keep their love, you're teaching your nervous system to accept emotional starvation as connection. That is not strength, that is trauma bonding. And if you stay in that cycle too long, you'll begin to forget what love is supposed to feel like. So what do? You recognize the test, but you don't participate in it. You hold compassion, but you also hold boundaries. You remain grounded, but you refuse to shrink. Because ultimately, your presence should never be a performance to pass someone else's emotional exam. And if you're in that position now, where someone is testing your patience, your loyalty, your worth, remember this. You are not here to prove you're enough for someone who doesn't yet believe love is safe. You're here to honor your worth, even if that means walking away from someone still too afraid to receive it. There's a moment in almost every dynamic with an avoidant where things start to get strange. Not distant, not silent, but emotionally erratic. The avoidant doesn't just disappear, they start behaving in ways that are contradictory, confusing, sometimes even self-sabotaging. One minute they're engaged, the next they're cold. They make a kind gesture, then lash out emotionally. They open up slightly, only to retreat into blame or defensiveness. And if you're on the receiving end, it feels like being caught in a whirlwind of mixed signals. But here's what's really happening beneath all that behavior. They're feeling more than they're ready to admit, and it terrifies them. You have to understand, for an avoidant, love is not a peaceful emotion. It's a storm. It activates everything they've spent years trying to suppress. The very feelings you and I might associate with joy, closeness, warmth, for them, it feels like emotional danger. Because in their world, vulnerability doesn't lead to connection, it leads to loss of control. And so when they begin to fall in love, truly fall, their internal world goes into chaos. This is when their behavior becomes most erratic. You'll start noticing emotional contradictions. They'll do something incredibly sweet, maybe even intimate, then follow it with a shutdown. They'll initiate contact, then ignore you the next day. They'll try to pull you close with one hand while pushing you away with the other. And if you try to call it out, if you try to make sense of it, they'll often blame you, not always directly, but passively, defensively. They might say things like you're overthinking or you're being too intense or I just need space. That blame is not about you. It's a projection of their own emotional dysregulation. Because when an avoidant starts catching feelings, the threat is no longer external, it's internal. They feel exposed, they feel seen, they feel emotionally activated in a way that bypasses their logical mind. And that's when panic sets in. Not panic in the traditional sense, but emotional destabilization. Their nervous system doesn't know how to handle closeness, so they revert to what they do know. Control, withdrawal, defensiveness, and emotional displacement. And here's the philosophical layer that most people never consider. This behavior is actually a form of emotional resistance. The avoidant isn't resisting you, they're resisting what love demands of them. Surrender. And that's the one thing they fear most, because surrender means risk. Surrender means uncertainty. Surrender means they can no longer manage their emotions from a safe, calculated distance. So when they start falling for you, they panic, not because you're wrong, but because you're real. You see, love requires chaos before it creates order. It breaks old patterns. It dissolves walls. It exposes the most unhealed parts of us. And for an avoidant, that exposure is unbearable. So what do? They deflect it. They disown it. They project it. They turn love into a battlefield because that's what makes sense to their survival system. Now here's where you have to be wise. When you see this emotional turbulence, don't mistake it for immaturity. Don't immediately write it off as manipulation either. Look deeper. Look at the timing. Does this emotional instability show up when the bond starts to deepen? When vulnerability is required? When you've shown them real consistency, real care? If so, then what you're seeing is the emotional fracture point where love meets fear. That's not rejection, that's resistance. And resistance is the greatest evidence that love is cracking through the armor. But let me give you a hard truth. Just because someone's struggling with love doesn't mean you're responsible for holding them together. You are not a rehabilitation center for emotionally unavailable people. You can recognize the pain behind their behavior, but you cannot become the casualty of their chaos. Emotional maturity means knowing the difference between compassion and self-sacrifice. Yes, an avoidant may blame you when they're falling for you. Yes, they may act out in ways that seem irrational or cold, but underneath it all is a heart that is terrified of being held. And you have a choice. Try to fix it or hold your boundary and honor your peace. And here's the shift. When you stop absorbing their emotional volatility and start observing it, everything changes. You stop personalizing their fear. You stop chasing their approval. You stop letting their avoidance dictate your worth. Because deep down, you know, their storm isn't your fault. It's their emotional reckoning with love. So the next time an avoidant starts acting out, when they turn love into tension, kindness into silence, closeness into confusion, don't just ask what they're doing. Ask what they're feeling but can't say. And remember this, just because someone is emotionally disoriented by love doesn't mean you have to lose yourself to prove yours. Stay grounded, stay awake, love them, but never abandon yourself to do it. There's a kind of silence that doesn't come from apathy, it comes from care. And that's the paradox most people miss when dealing with avoidantly attached individuals. See, everyone talks about the avoidance need for space, their disappearing acts, their emotional distance, but what they don't talk about is why they disappear. They don't just vanish to hurt you, they vanish to protect you from themselves. Now, at first glance, that sounds backwards. How can someone love you and still walk away? How can someone care and still go cold? But you have to understand, for the avoidant, love feels dangerous. Not because of you, but because of what love exposes in them. Closeness brings to the surface all the unresolved trauma, the unspoken fears, the beliefs that carried for years that tell them I'm not enough, or if I get too close, I'll lose myself. Or worse, if you really get to know me, you'll leave. So what do they do when they start to feel deep affection for you? They retreat. But here's the hidden layer. It's not to punish you. It's not even to preserve the relationship. It's to minimize the potential damage they fear they will cause. In their minds, silence is mercy. Disappearing is protection. Pulling back is how they avoid doing something worse, like letting you see how broken or unstable they feel inside. This is one of the hardest truths to accept because it feels personal. When someone goes silent, it triggers our own insecurities. We assume we weren't enough, that our love wasn't received, that we misread the connection. But more often than not, especially with avoidance, the silence isn't a rejection of you. It's a confession, a silent cry that says, I care, but I don't trust myself to love you right. Think about that. They know at some level that they can't show up fully. They recognize that their patterns are destructive. They feel the pull of love and the fear of ruining it. So rather than stay and risk breaking something beautiful, they choose to step back, to go ghost, to observe you from a safe emotional distance. Now here's what most people miss. Avoidants don't go silent when they don't care.